Let's talk about your comeback. You mentioned after not working after Star Trek, that episode, and the courtship of Eddie's father. Yes.
We have to go back to start that. We have to go back to, this was 1968. We have to go back to 1962. On my the second Dr. Kildare, I was directing Carolyn Jones in the show where she played a girl with a big nose, a plastic surgery show. And I didn't know it at the time, but Jimmy Comack, who was a friend of Carolyn's and was out from New York, he was, Jimmy was an actor to begin with. He was an actor-singer in Damn Yankees on Broadway and in the movie, and a writer, producer, aspiring. And he was on the set with Carolyn, and I, in November, after the firing, I had a call from my agent to say, go out to MGM to meet with Jimmy Comack. And I went out, and Jimmy told me he had been on the set watching, had come to visit Carolyn and had been on the set when we were shooting, and he liked that when I talked to an actor and gave them, to give them corrections, that I always did it very quietly. Nobody ever knew that I went over, and it was a total private conversation. I never wanted an actor to, I didn't want an actor to have everybody in the room checking to see whether he was doing what the director told him to. So, nobody was to know what it was he was trying to do. That was my goal. He liked that, and he was doing this new show, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, and he didn't want sitcom directors. He didn't want to treat it as a sitcom. He wanted to go in a different direction, and he did. And the direction was brilliant, what he did. And that was why he asked me to come aboard, and I did, and loved the show. I think it's one of the gems that has slipped through the cracks.
How was working with Bill Bixby?
Oh, dynamite. Just dynamite. Just dynamite. And Bill, not only, he was just a superlative actor. Total, that easy charm that you see on screen, that's Bill. That's Bill. That was Bill all the time. And not only that, but I didn't get to the show until November, and I'm not sure when they went into production, probably September. So Brandon, when little Brandon Cruz, who at that point was 6 years old, he was raw material. And Bill, I think, is the one who helped form him. Just by saying, Brandon, now listen to me and pay attention to me and, mean it. And so that by the time I got to him, sometimes I would have to, if Bill wasn't in the scene, I would have to remind Brandon to do it. But most of the time, Bill had set him up. And I just think that little kid I think he's lovely in the show.
You directed a few episodes of Bill Cosby's first sitcom, The Bill Cosby Show, not The Cosby Show.
That's right.
What was that experience like working with Bill Cosby?
Well, what happened that year, once I started doing, I hadn't worked for a while. Now, first I did The Courtship of Eddie's Father. Then one of the people that I had known back in my CBS days was now an agency rep. And one of the shows he was assigned to was The Cosby Show. And they were having director problems. And he was the one who suggested me. He suggested me. And he was the one who was at the screening. He had been involved in the Mission Impossible, which was a couple of years before this. So he was the one, and so I was called over, and I did 4 of them. And Cosby was great. I'd worked with Cosby before on I Spy, which was not a good experience, but not because of him. And no, he was fine, just fine to work with.
Did you feel it was a collaboration with him? What was it like a collaboration with him? And did he have a lot of ideas? But
oh, absolutely. And there again, the director is not there to tell, especially an actor in a series, in a continuing role, playing himself, how to play himself. The main thing is to stage scenes, and I don't. I just never had any actor say, well, that doesn't feel right. I don't want to do that. So, I mean, whatever I was doing was right, and I would do that, and then they would fall into place. There was one scene we did with Bill, and I don't even remember which one of the 4 shows it was on, where he was with a bunch of kids. And we decided, and we just turned the camera on, and he was improvising and playing off the kids, and we just shot it. You know, he kind of wanted to do that way, and I said, fine, and we did it. No, he was charming to work with. I did one with him and Cicely Tyson, whom I had already worked with. I'd already worked with her on Courtship. I'd already worked with her on East Side, West Side. I did one with Rex Ingram, playing a black Santa Claus. I think it was the last role he ever played. He had been in one of the Breaking Points that I did. He played a black Santa Claus. No, it was a good show. I don't know why. Stephen Bowie has written about that show, and he commends that show and praises it and says it's a better show than the later Huxtable Family show. But it didn't take, and who knows why.
How did you feel about being asked to direct The Partridge Family?
Well, I thought it was strange that I was asked, and there again, I don't know who in that group asked for me, but again, that was that same year. I mean, those 2 shows, Partridge Family, and then the other sitcom I did that year was Nanny and the Professor, which was being produced by one of my closest friends, Charlie Fitzsimons. So I mean, all of a sudden, I was a sitcom director. In fact, to the point where my agents tried to book me with David. Oh God, how can I forget David, who produced Marcus Welby?
Simon, no.
He was a producer on Dr. Kildare. That's awful. I'm blank.
But did they not consider you at that point?
No. David said, but he's a sitcom director.
But he'd worked with you on Dr. Kildare.
Yes,
right?
yes, and I'd done, and not only that, and I'd in Dr. Kildare, and I'd also directed Name of the Game. What the hell is his last name? Oh wow! It's time to hang him up, Senensky.
We'll try to figure that out. But on Partridge Family, assuming that the musical numbers were pre-recorded, was lip syncing? Did that cause problems in terms of how you shot?
No. Yeah, I mean, David, who actually was lip syncing to his own recordings, and he had no problem. Shirley was an old pro at it, and she just had to mouth the words, but because her voice wasn't actually on the track, and the kids, I think, were kind of remarkable, being as young as they were. That I never shot any of the kids in real up close up, so we were far enough if they were off a beat. But no, they did just fine.
So Shirley Jones, that wasn't her voice on the recordings?
No.
But David Cassidy is the only one who was actually
as
on...
As far as I know.
Okay.
I read that. I just did that, I think, listening to one of the archive interviews with her, because I was never sure. I didn't think that she was, but
the producer, David Victor?
David Victor, yes. Okay. Sorry, David.
Okay.
That's getting back at you for not hiring me.
For this run of sitcoms you were doing, did you approach directing comedy differently than directing drama?
No.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. And I had somebody responded to my blog about that and talked about, which episode was it? I think Partridge Up a Pear Tree, and talked about it and just commended it and thought it was a textbook on how sitcoms should be directed. No, I directed it the same way. Which is the way comedy should be directed. I mean, comedy is real. And I can tell you a story about that. You go back to Playhouse 90. It was a show I wasn't doing. They were doing a Playhouse 90 version of The Male Animal. And the day after, Friday, the day after, it was like we had a Broadway. Fridays after a Playhouse 90 were like the day after a Broadway opening. I mean, there were reviews in papers, and people gathered at water coolers to talk about it. And Lenny Horne, who was the associate producer, was in the office the next morning, and he said, "What'd you think of the show?" And I said, "Well, I didn't like it." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, it wasn't real." And he said, "Yeah, but it's comedy."
You directed about a dozen episodes of The Waltons over a 5-year period.
Yes.
Was that show a good fit for you?
Oh, perfect fit. Perfect fit.
Why?
To begin with, Earl Hamner and I are the same age. I'm a couple of months older than Earl. We're the same age, so we're out of the same period. He was in a small town in Virginia. I was in a small town in Iowa. And if there were customs of the area and dialect and all that, that could be the same. But basically, just that era and that period. I mean, we were raised in very like periods, and the Waltons was just like putting on an old pair of shoes.
What stamp did Earl Hamner Jr. put on the Waltons? What did he?
I used to say he Waltonized them. That he would take it. He doesn't admit to this, but Earl used to take a script. The final script, would take it, and he would go through it, and maybe change a bit of dialogue here and a bit of dialogue there. And I mean, he literally, as I said, he Waltonized it.
Let's talk briefly about some of the episodes, some of the specific episodes.
You want to talk about my favorites?
Sure, but they'll probably come up. But if not, then we'll add to it. But Ron Howard guest starred in an episode called The Gift.
Yes.
Why was that a special episode?
It was only the second one I did. It was the first strong drama, and it was a powerful drama. Carol McKean, who was the story editor, was her script. It was the first script of hers ever to be produced. And it was about a young boy, Jason's close friend, who discovers that he has leukemia. And to me, it was the Waltons face death. All of a sudden, somebody close to them is dying, and the mother, how she responded, how John Boy responded, especially how Jason responded. There was a scene with the grandfather, how he responded. I put in a shot of the two young kids when they come home and they're going to tell the rest of the family that the boy has leukemia and what's going to happen. The two young ones, Jim Bob and Elizabeth, are sent out of the room, and they go up the steps, and I did a shot of them stopping at the top of the steps and listening to this talk about death. And it was like a dirge. I mean, it was a very, very sad show, but beautifully acted. And Ron was fine. And Jason, John Walmsley, in an interview, has written that Ron told him that he got the shootist because of this, of his performance in that. He was a fine young actor.
Tell me who Beulah Bondi is and what was her contribution to an episode called The Conflict.
Beulah Bondi is one of the greats of Hollywood, one of the true greats. In the mid-'50s, this is many years before, I did a play at the Horseshoe Stage, The Immoralist, with Rachel Ames, whose mother was Dorothy Adams, one of the great faces of silver screen. Well, Doro was a close friend of Beulah, and she brought Beulah to see the play. And I didn't get to meet Beulah then, but I asked Doro afterward. I said, "Would it be all right if I called Miss Bondi?" And she said yes. So I called her, and that was my introduction to her on the phone, and she's just stressed the importance of being real, that true acting is being, not seeming. And then in 1974, this is close to 20 years later, when we came time to do the conflict, and I had remembered her, from having met her there, but I had remembered her from so many movies, Make Way for Tomorrow, but one of my favorite movies was Trail of the Lonesome Pine, where she played this mountain woman. And so she was the one I wanted, and everybody agreed. And we cast her. And just a superlative lady. I mean, the most total actress probably that I've ever worked with.
What kind of a character did she play in the conflict?
She played a mountain woman. Okay. She played Grandpa Walton's sister-in-law. And now my stories about Beulah, I can do a whole reel just on Beulah.
The episode, The Marathon, how did that relate to your own personal experience?
The first year, sometime during the first year, must have been sometime after I'd done The Gift, one day Robert Jacks, the producer, said, come on, let's go to a screening room. So I went with him, and we screened. They shoot horses, don't they? And he told me he had tried to get the option to make that movie and had failed. He didn't win out. I didn't know at the time what he had in mind. He then commissioned to do a script about the marathons of the 30s. And I guess he had picked me out to do it. Now, what he didn't know was that when I was about 10 years old, there was a marathon, a dance marathon in Mason City at the Armory. And we went every Friday night. And I was so caught up in it. Every morning when I got up, I would call to see who had dropped out the night before. And Friday nights they had a talent contest. And I entered one night, played piano and won first prize, 50 cents. It was Depression. No, that show. That's one of my two favorite episodes of the Waltons. And on that show, the art directors did an incredible job, and we needed a huge hall. Well, the budget, and there wasn't the space to do it. So Ed Graves, the art director, set up a big black cyclorama, and then there were no walls. Then he just set up bleachers, the platform for the piano, and some columns, and that was it. And then Russell Meddy, that superlative cameraman, then lit it, and you're not aware that you're not in a big room. And Russell Meddy, who at this point was an elderly man, not too well, and on the Waltons, as a rule, he could just sit in his chair, and with his gaffing crew, he could dictate. That show, he did not sit in his chair. He was out on his feet because he was lighting it, and it's I just think some spectacular work. Loved it.
So Beulah Bondi returned in an episode called The Pony Cart.
Yes.
And I believe she was nominated for an Emmy.
She won.
She won an Emmy, right?
It's sitting at the top of my stairway.
What did that episode mean for you?
Oh, well, again, it was special because of her, and it was written, and it was almost like a tone poem. And I picked up Beulah one day during the prep period. She wanted to go to the studio for wardrobe fitting, and she also asked if she could look at the second reel of Conflict. So I did, picked her up. We went, had lunch at the studio. She went to wardrobe. Afterwards, she went to the studio. Then when I took her home, she had some suggestions on the script, which I made note of, so I took to Earl to have him make the changes in the script. And as I was leaving, I said, well, Beulah, knowing her, do you know all your lines? Because she would be line perfect and have everything worked out before you had your first rehearsal. And she said, not yet. She said, I should have them by Thursday. Then my work will begin. And that was the way she worked. It was the way she worked.
Did any other cast members win Emmys under your direction?
That very same year, Gary, oh God, here we go again, on Family. Franks.
Okay.
Gary Franks, again, was nominated, And the show that he submitted was the show that I had directed of Gary and Elizabeth Ashley.
You directed a very powerful episode of The Waltons called Grandma Comes Home.
Yes.
Ellen Geer had already had a stroke.
Ellen Corby.
Ellen Corby, I'm sorry.
Yes. That was her return after a year. She had been away for a year. Will Geer was responsible. He just was relentless in going at the producers that Ellen needed to come back. I mean, she needed it for her sake. And because of that, Andy White, who was by then producing, called me and asked me if I would come direct it. And so I did. I said, absolutely. And we were very careful. They spaced her scenes out so that she wouldn't have a lot of scenes in any one day. We scheduled her scenes early. Lorimar was very close with the buck, but they gave me 2 cameras at all times so that I could shoot. When I was shooting her, I could shoot the over-shoulder and the close-up all in one take. And she was just remarkable. She would do, well, there was a scene where she is shelling peas with Olivia, who comes out on the porch, and Olivia's going, no, snap beans, snapping off the ends, not shelling peas, but snap beans of snapping. And Olivia comes out, and she wants to help, so she starts doing it, and then starts talking, but it ends with her breaking down because nobody needs me. I drove Rod and Claire Peterson, the writers of that fine script, who had also written another great script, The Firestorm. I drove them crazy on that script because it kept coming, and I knew where I wanted it to go, and the words that were there just didn't get me there. And I finally, I think like 5 days in a row, each day they would deliver pages to me, a new version, and I didn't, and it probably was my fault because I didn't really say what was wrong. It just was wrong. And finally they came, and I said, okay, I can make this work, and it does work. And the day that we shot it with 2 cameras, and we would start in. This was a long scene for her, so she had things to say and things to do, and I would sit and say, now, Ellen, and I would talk her through it, and what you do here and what you do there, and then she'd look at me and then she'd go, like, do it again, do it again, do it again. Finally, she was ready. Well, we did this scene, and we had the 2 cameras, and the assistant cameraman on the second camera was somebody I knew from Star Trek. He had been a grip now, and now he was an assistant cameraman. And we did the scene where she breaks down at the end. Powerful. And afterward, he just turned and looked at me like, what's going on here? And the next day at Daly's, I get choked up even thinking about it. When the first take showed, and at the end of the take, Earl Hamner's voice from this dark screening room said, "Senensky, you son of a bitch." Nicest words anybody ever called me.
And the end of the episode, the trademark ending, the Goodnight John Boy ending, you changed a little bit on that episode.
Which was the second time I did that.
What?
The first time I did it was on the Waltons on Conflict, when I had asked Bobby Jacks, they had the voiceovers. Ralph and Olivia, Ralph and Michael were singing. There's an old spinning wheel in the corner, and I went to Bobby Jacks and said, rather than just them doing it, can't I have? I mean, she has left them the spinning wheel. Can I do a shot in the living room of the camera just coming through this dark room and ending on the spinning wheel, and then you cut back to the full house when the lights go out, and he jumped at it. And so when it came to that, we said absolutely we would go in and show her saying those last words. And when she said it again, I was standing by the camera, and she had to say, "Good night, everyone." And just before she said it, I had the camera pushed into a close-up, and just before I wanted her to say it, I said, "Good night, everyone," and then she said it.
Very powerful. Let's try to go quickly through some other series, just a quick comment or impression about some of the other shows you did in the 70s. Barnaby Jones with Buddy Ebsen.
That was fine. I mean, by that time, there were two things that were happening. Number one, not only Quinn shows by then, but so many shows were falling into this detective formula. And, Buddy was great, but you really were bucking the fact that, I mean, he just was kind of old to be playing a detective. I mean, it was using him, the detective format, and, I mean, they did it with him, they did it with Dick Van Dyke. I mean, when they had a star that they wanted to do a series with, well, make him a detective. So, I mean, it was fine, but I was not.
Okay. What impact did the illness of Diana Hyland have on the...
Say again?
What impact did the illness of Diana Hyland have on the cast of Eight is Enough?
On which show?
Eight is Enough.
Oh, she was, well, Diana at that point, I did not know when, I knew I had already worked with Diana 3 or 4 times, and I did not know she was ill until I got to the studio, and Robert Jacks told me that she was ill, and at that point that they were sending a crew out each week to tape a phone call, and then I talked to her on the phone for just a few moments. She died before I started shooting. So it was, it was sad. It was very sad.
Lou Grant, Ed Asner.
Oh, all I remember about that was that was not a terribly happy experience. I don't know. It had a formula, and it was so rigid. It was more rigid than I like to be. And then I had this Indian show where, at this point, we had to use all Indians, and then they had all this stock footage of some big Indian festival, and we were going to use that. And then I was shooting stuff of people being there. It was a chore. I mean, as so many of the shows by this late date, after the Waltons, pretty much everything was a chore.
You did a number of episodes of a series called Insight.
Yes, I did.
Briefly, what was that show, and who is Father Kaiser?
Father Kaiser was a Paulist priest. He was 6'10", 6'4". Father Kaiser was probably the most dynamic producer that I've ever met. I mean, he was a producer of that show. He had guest stars who would come and work for free. I mean, big names: Gene Raymond, Jane Wyman. I mean, these people. I mean, he would call in. They would come at his bidding. He was great. He was just great, and it was. You think because it was Paulist priest that it, Paulist production, that it might be a religious show, and it wasn't. There were little morality shows. I really liked doing it because, again, it was about something. I can remember a time when I had a script from QM for, I don't remember what show it was, and I turned it down. It just was a dumb plot, and I didn't want to do it. And that was turning down money, and then I had a script from Insight, which I did, and which I always did for free.
And Insight was shot on tape, is that right?
Yes, and which is one of the reasons I wanted to do it, because I'd gone through all the training, to learn how to do tape, and then it died. Mm-hmm. And so it was my way of doing it, and I never really conquered it. I really never conquered it.
On Heart to Heart, was the chemistry, the screen chemistry between Robert Wagner and
Yes.
Stephanie Powers. Was that?
It was real.
It was real.
Yeah, they were great performers. They had great affection for each other, and they just knew how to do it.
So for a director, did that make it easier to direct because of the light, to keep the lighthearted
Oh yeah,
tone?
yeah. And RJ and I got along just fine. Well, I got along with Stephanie too, but RJ and I really got along fine.
Tell me about your role in the creation of Dynasty.
That will take 2 reels.
It's very.
It will take 2 reels to do that because, I shot it twice. And it's a long story that I don't know that I can even do it in a short. And a lot of the story has never been told.
Well, let's see if we can do a briefer version of it, possibly. Did you? There was a pilot for Dynasty.
I shot the pilot.
And you shot the pilot.
I shot
right?
the pilot. And I started it. I went in on February 29th. I remember that day because I went in, was interviewed and was hired, and was to start on Monday. And I was not stupid enough to think that I was then the first director they had talked to. I mean, you don't hire a director on Friday. I mean, if you've been looking for directors. And what I couldn't figure out was why they hadn't found a director. I mean, why had directors turned that show down? Because I thought it was a sensational script. And just a personal note, on that day, I was hired early afternoon, went home, 6 o'clock, received a phone call that a very close relative of mine, very close, had committed suicide. So we started in on that. And the first big thing was to find the location. And the Aaron Spelling production people they wanted the show to be shot in Los Angeles. They didn't want it to go on location. And Phil Parslow, the producer, and I started looking, and there just was no place. Well, to begin with, he and I flew to Denver to take a look to see whether, since the setting for it was Denver, we flew to Denver, and Denver, although the show took place in Denver, Denver didn't look like it was going to work at all. So we came back, and then we started looking for the house in L.A., and I remember we went to the Doheny Estates, and I saw, there was a stairway there that we could use. And then we went to some house that Marion Davies owned, and there was a big, glorious library with a balcony up there. But there was just nothing. And then finally one morning I came to work, and Phil said, we're flying up to look at a location. We're flying up to Filoli. And I said, okay. So we got in a plane, and they took me up to Filoli, which is over in Woodside. Do you know the place?
No.
Well, it's the setting. It's the setting, and it had been around forever. At this point, it was a foundation. The people that owned it could no longer afford the taxes, so it had been given to somebody, and it was a foundation, and it was spectacular. I think they had 7 major gardens. Everything was there, exteriors, interiors. It was just fine. And we came back, and the assistant director, who at that point was assigned to the show, said, well, it's just as good as I always knew it would be. So he knew about it the whole time and had not told us because of the production people at Fox. So I went to Phil Parslow and told him that, did we want our first assistant to be somebody whose allegiance was to us or to them? And so Phil got rid of him and installed somebody else as the production manager. So that's that phase of it. Then we went into the casting. And of course, George Peppard was brought in to meet us. They didn't come in to read, but they came in to meet us. I remember, I think Linda came in, Tyne Daly came in, George came in with orange hair. He just gotten off something. He still had orange hair. And he was gung-ho to do it because he said he really didn't want to do a star piece. He wanted to do an ensemble piece. And that's what the Shapiros, Esther and Richard, insisted that this was. It was an ensemble piece.
And they created Dynasty.
They created and wrote the script. And as Esther has said, actually, Richard does most of the writing. I mean, she's in there with the structure, and they work together. But when it comes down to the writing, Richard does it. He's a brilliant writer. And we cast George. We did on tape tests for the chauffeur and for Stephen, the son. And because this was where my tape experience came in, because we went over to ABC, and using multiple cameras and tape, I was able to do full scenes and tested 4 people. I think John James tested for Stephen, Al Corley tested for Stephen. I don't remember who the other 2 were, and I don't remember any of the people that tested for the chauffeur. Nobody that tested for the chauffeur one was cast, but we did cast Al Corley. So that was done. Are we out?
Yeah, keep going.
I'll keep going.
Go ahead.
No, I think we prepped for about 6 weeks. It was about a 6-week prep before we got it all done. And the first day of shooting, I and some of the stars were brought up to Filoli over the weekend, and then the crew left. They assembled in L.A. Monday morning, flew up, were brought out, and we went into the mountains behind the house to represent the hills, of the Rockies, and shot a scene with Linda and Bo, and then I had 2 more scenes. Another scene to do behind the house. There was a long stretch of road with great white trees, and it was going to be a track shot, and I had laid out yards and yards and yards of track for the camera, and it was George and Pamela Sue Martin walking the horse and talking and stopping. Well, 2 things happened. During the morning, George had rehearsed with Pamela and had directed her. And then when it came time for him to do his part, we just barely got that scene in the can and dropped the second scene. And the next day at Daly's, nobody was happy with what George did, because George did not take direction. George came in to do his thing, and George did his thing, and they weren't too happy with it. Then, when the Shapiros talked to him to try to get him on track of what they wanted, he took exception, and all of a sudden there was a big rift there. Then, so that they didn't talk to him. There came a time I was the only one who was talking to him, and I just had to stand on good terms, and I did. Then, all of a sudden, the show was pre-sold. All of a sudden, ABC now wanted, they couldn't ask for a pilot because we were doing this, and they couldn't ask for anything special. They said, well, do a presentation. So the Shapiros worked out that what we would do to save time, every time I had a setup in a scene, when the scene was done and it was all lit, just put George in the center, put the camera on him, and then they would have a bit of dialogue for him to say that would tie the different scenes together. And so came the day when we were to do the first scene that we did that, and we said if we had shot the sequence there, put George in the center where he was lit already, put the camera on him, and George didn't do the script that the Shapiros had provided for him. He had rewritten it, and he was talking about his show and his supporting cast and his this and his that. And, at this point, I wasn't going to argue with them. I mean, I didn't want to do it to begin with, and I had a schedule to meet. I didn't have time to fuss over that. Well, they just blew their stack the next day, and things never did right themselves after that. So that 21 days, we'd returned to L.A. On the 21st day of shooting, we were on location, and Phil Parslow came to me and said, there was a scene. There was a scene of Blake and Linda in the car as they were pulling up. They were going to be flying. They were going to be flying to San Francisco to go to Chinatown. And he said, "Can you plan it? Don't shoot that scene here. Plan so that you'll be able to shoot the scene in the car later, because George is done as of today, but don't say anything." And so that's what he did. He told me that, and it was fine. He went to each of the cast members out of respect to explain it to them. Always don't say anything to anybody. But what he didn't know was that the cast members, because they were all wired with radio mics for their scenes, in no time the whole crew knew, which was not his intention. And that was where that got to, so that we then closed down, had time to put the film together, reassess. They recast John, which was my understanding they wanted from the beginning. And just days before we were to resume shooting sometime in August, there was a strike, and I think it was the writers, but I'm not sure. I think it was the writers who went on strike. And we're on strike until October, so that we didn't resume filming until October. And then that was that. There's a scene in there between Fallon, Pamela Sue Martin, and Wayne, the chauffeur, where her close-up was shot in October and his close-up was shot in April, which I don't know why that always tickled me.
So John Forsythe replaced George Papard.
He was a dream from the word go.
And did you have to reshoot the pilot completely, or?
No, we just reshot. We just reshot the scenes that needed to be reshot. Okay. Plus, which by this time they knew that the show was 2.5 hours long, and they either had the option of ending the 2-hour pilot not at the wedding, which was their intention, but after that wonderful scene between the father and the son, where the father finds out the boy is homosexual. And they didn't want to end it there. And Esther talked the network into doing a 3-hour pilot. And in her interview on your website, she talks about that, how many times she had to call Tony to get him to do it. And so they also were rewriting more material to flesh out that. But no, John was fine. There was a scene where flowers galore are brought into Crystal's house. And at the end of it, there's a knock at the door, and she goes, and it's Blake. Well, we had shot it with George, and he had this bouquet, which the script called for. Well, we didn't have to reshoot the whole thing. I mean, everything was there except opening the door. It was John who said he didn't want to have a pretty little bouquet. He had one wilted, looked like a dandelion. That was all that was left at the flower shop. That kind of ingenuity. No, he was superlative.
So you didn't stay with Dynasty for long. Why is that?
No. Well, I had been booked to do the pilot, the 2-hour pilot in 4 episodes. The 3-hour pilot now took care of one of those episodes. I sat out an episode because I wanted to cut. I shot one, and then when we did it originally, I would have been done sometime early June, and I would have been free for the pilot season. This extended so long that now, I mean, I got an offer to go do a pilot. And quite frankly, I'd been on it. I literally had been on for a year, from March 1st until into November. And there was also the scripts that were coming out now were not what the pilot script had been. I mean, just of necessity. I mean, Richard was no longer writing them, and I asked to just to be released from the further commitments, and they weren't too happy about it, but they did, and so I moved over to do a pilot for Norman Rosemont.
Let's talk. We have about 5 minutes left, so I think we can get through the rest here. Let's talk about The Paper Chase. Okay, that was one of the very first original dramas on. Well, I know it was spun off from the movie, but that Showtime did.
When Showtime did it, they had already.
It was a network show already, right?
It had been. They had run for a season on CBS,
okay.
And John Houseman, from the time that it had been canceled, he had been looking for a way to get it back on. He just thought it was too good to die, and he was right. And he finally did the Showtime thing, and I had finished a very unpleasant project that summer, and I just said, if this is what television is, thank you, but no thank you. And as a matter of fact, after that, the agent had called. There was a episodic nighttime soap what I got for an interview to do an episode, and I said no, I just wouldn't go. I didn't want any part of it. Then later, toward the end of the year, they called and they asked would I go out to meet Lynn Roth on The Paper Chase, and I said, yeah, I'll go do that. And I went out, and she called me out not to interview me to see whether to hire me. She called me out to ask me whether I would consider doing a show about abortion. And it was a great script, and I said, you bet. It was a wonderful, wonderful script. The best script I did about half a dozen of them. And it was that first script was the best script. We did that show very unusual. Number one, it was shot on 16 millimeter film. And Ed, can't remember his last, Taylor maybe. Ed Taylor? Somebody Taylor. He had to light differently for 16 millimeter than he would have lit for the other. Then the film was never developed. The negative was developed, and then the negative was transferred to tape, and we edited the show on tape. And John Woodcock, who had cut the pilot of Dynasty, was the editor doing that, and we cut those shows on tape. And that's the way that show was done.
Was the fact that it was on Showtime, did that hinder your role as a director compared to like a network show?
Not at all. No. I think I was paid less than if it had been on network, but outside of that, no.
How has technology affected directing through your career, and from what you know about it today? Has technology been an aid?
Oh, I don't know if it's the technology. Well, maybe the technology is getting in the way of the creativity. I mean, Gene Ruggiero, who edited the Norman Rosemont film for me, said something so spectacular. Norman was talking about the chem editor, which I never saw, but a chem was a big screen, and then film rolled by you in front, and it was projected up there. And then if there was an edit, the editor could stop it, mark the film, and it just rolled by. And Norman was extolling its the effectiveness and how wonderful it was. And Gene Ruggiero, this 70-year-old who had an Oscar for Around the World in 80 Days, and the whole story of how he began in the business. You can read about it on my website. He just shook his head to me, held up his hand, rubbed his thumb against his fingers, and said, "You can't feel the film." And I just think that applies in so many instances, to feel the film. I'm not sure that with the technology today that they're feeling it. I don't know.
What are you proudest of in your career?
That I'm still here.
What advice would you give to an aspiring director today?
Turn the clock back and let's go back and do the way they did it back in the 50s and the 60s. And if we can't turn the clock back, let's do some way to go back and see how they were doing it, not in the result, but just in the approach to the work, to the dedication to the work and the commitment to the work, and try to bring some of that back.
Any regrets?
Me?
You?
None. No. I've had a fine life, no.
How would you like to be remembered?
I am being. I am being.
Ralph, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. You've made this very easy. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very
Very
much.
good.
Thank you all.